Okay, well, welcome everybody to this webinar on the findings of the project on vegan leather cricket gear. The project has been funded by the AHRC Impact Accelerator account. One always has to state the funders from the UK RI, and we've partnered, we being University of Creative Arts, have partnered with University of Cambridge Centre for Natural Material Innovation on this project, with some involvement from other colleagues. And the presenters today are myself, that's Martin Charter, Darshil Shah, and Lilian Sanchez Moreno. So without further ado, maybe we'll go into the next slide. Can you move? Yeah, great. Thanks, Lilian. The project really evolved from activities based at the Centre for Sustainable Design, and we've really been looking at sustainability and innovation and design and development since about 1995. And it's sort of quite difficult to pin down in my mind with the takeaway equations from COVID when we actually started to think about cricket and sustainability. But the initial discussions in the industry, we started looking at sport, looking at cricket, and the initial discussions with the industry were saying, yeah, we're sort of interested in sustainability in cricket gear, but our focus is mainly on venues, on the impact of climate change on the sector, and sort of facilities. So, because in many ways that's where energy in the built environment, amongst stadia and travel, etc., are the biggest impact. So, what then happened was we sort of put that to bed a little bit, but then, you know, over the last sort of, must be the last sort of 5 years, or 3 to 5 years, we revisited really looking at sustainability and cricket gear, and we found relatively little research on that matter. Plenty of research on performance and psychology and even the sociology of cricket and the history, particularly of cricket, but very little on the, sustainability impacts of the game used, the gear used to play the game. And bearing in mind, it's the second largest sport in the world, we thought that was a bit of a gap. And as part of this, we set up a series of webinars and research, collaborating with BASIS. And as part of this whole process, we came across Darshil, who's the inventor of the bamboo cricket bat. And we thought it might be great if we could collaborate with Darshil and his team. And so we put in for an internal funding to look at, the emerging area of the use of vegan leathers as a substitute for bovine leathers in relevant cricket gear. Next slide, please. So this very much also fits within the broader idea of circular economy, use of bio-based materials or potentially bio-based materials to substitute non-renewable materials. As part of the team, sorry, Lillian, so there's these are the partners in the program, and we have myself, Martin, and with a experience across business, design, sustainability. And then Darshil, whose background is natural materials innovation and a variety of all around that topic, and Beth, his colleague, and Lillian, my colleague, who came in from industrial design, and then Tom Clark, who is a very experienced consultant that's been working with us on the area. So next slide, please. So yes, the idea was really to look at the use of vegan leather, as a substitute for bovine leather in cricket gear. And really the project was to identify and then analyze existing vegan leathers and look at the potential feasibility for the substitution in relevant cricket gear. And those relevant cricket gear we end up deeming to be gloves, both batters and wicket keepers, and balls, with a particular focus in the end on gloves. But the work that Darshil and his team did was really to look at the sort of state of the art in the supply of vegan leathers and do some practical testing. So next slide, please. And this project is part of a series of projects that we're doing really to look at circularity of cricket gear. And this includes, studying the extent of reuse, refurbishment, and repair of cricket gear, and also broader opportunities around the proactive use of circular design and innovation in cricket gear. So next slide, please. So the project background, have we skipped a slide here, or is this a slide before? No.
So
is it okay? So this is a slide. That's fine. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So both Lillian and I were in Finland last week and haven't had a chance to chat. So sorry about our choreography there, but we'll get there in the end. So we've been collated data on markets for the cricket gear and vegan and leather use. We've also done a player survey of, a broader player survey around circularity of cricket gear, asking specific questions around vegan leather, evaluated existing British standards in the area. And then we researched into the details of vegan leathers, as well as looking at a refurbishment of a glove and using a vegan leather and the development of a prototype wicket keeping glove. So I'll shut up there and I'll pass to the meat of the presentation and over to Darshil.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone. And yeah, we'll be continue talking about vegan leathers for cricket balls and cricket gloves. I think that was the main purpose or the main focus of what Beth and I were working on. So there were a couple of main elements of the research that we wanted to carry forward. Lillian, would you go to the next slide, please? Offering some of the context first, as Martin was mentioning as well, cricket is one of the most gear-intensive sports, and based on some of our previous research as well, including on bamboo cricket bats, it's a key candidate for innovation. Some of you might be surprised, there has not been that much development in cricket gear materials over the past century or so, or 2 centuries even. So for cricket bats, for example, they have been made from willow since the late 1800s. There are a few examples where there have been innovations, for instance, in the handle, for example, but not necessarily execution of these, and there has been stringent opposition around this as well. And similarly with cricket balls, for example, leather has been used for the outer casing of balls for a very long time. The primary innovation that has come through and integrated into the sport has been because of the advent of polymeric materials, particularly in the mid-1900s, with the development of foams and textiles, so polyurethanes, polyesters. These sorts of materials started to get integrated into a variety of different cricket gears, including apparel, so clothing, but also, for instance, in the gloves and the foams that are found in cricket pads and in gloves. So this was interesting, and what the drivers of this might have been is something we are trying to hypothesize. Martin might have alluded to this as well. The cricket gear industry is, they don't share many things very readily, and it's difficult for us to decipher why certain decisions have been taken or why certain innovations have not been carried forward, for example. So a bit of reverse engineering But again, that is quite interesting from a design perspective. So cricket ball casings and the palms of batting gloves specifically are made of bovine leather. So for instance, just a batting glove in hand, this element over here is Pittard's leather. It comes usually from sheepskin, whereas the gloves are hide leather, bovine leather. And I'll talk a bit about their details shortly as well. Leather itself is a natural material, and we at the Center for Natural Material Innovation are interested in a variety of different natural materials. And it's a material that is quite difficult to replicate, and that's particularly fascinating. So it has very interesting properties in terms of moisture resistance, moisture repellence, durability, as well as its texture and softness, suppleness, for instance. And that is why it's a very versatile material. You'll find it in furniture, you'll find it in the automotive sector used very often, including in very high-end products, as well as for shoes and sporting applications. However, because it is derived from the animal industry, it does have a significant environmental impact. So high embodied energy, 80 to 100 megajoules per kilogram, carbon footprint of about 4 to 5 kilograms CO2 equivalent per kilogram of material. And this is fairly comparable, if not higher than that of polyurethanes, polyesters, so of the plastic industry. And again, that in some ways doesn't come as a surprise. It also requires a huge amount of water in comparison to the production of polymers. And the primary sources of this high impact tend to be because of intensive cattle farming and also the tanning processes that are used to produce the leather that we go on to use. It's something I mentioned about the wood industry, for example. So timber in nature is a wet material, but the first thing that we do to use it is we dry it. And that is the most high intensive process that we do to wood to make it an engineering, a reliable material. Similarly, for leathers, naturally, it would be a sustainable material because it's a waste product, for example, but because we tan it, and that requires the use of chromium, for example, and a number of other chemical processes, it tends to have a significantly higher eco impact as well. And then there are also ethics and evolving consumer behaviors, veganism particularly, as a driving mechanism for innovation, particularly in the fashion sector, where we have started to see a huge number of vegan leather alternatives are coming about. In sporting applications, and particularly for cricket balls, wicket keeping, or inner gloves for batsmen as well, there has been no substantial movement away from animal hide leathers. Next slide, Lillian. Thank you. So the aims and scope of the project that we were trying to address in the 9 to 12 weeks that we were primarily focusing our energy on this work for was to do with exploring the potential for hide leathers to be replaced by sustainable alternatives for cricket balls and gloves. And we refer to sustainable here mainly in the sense that as part of this project, we didn't do life cycle assessment. As part of future projects we have. However, in this case, sustainable is self-certified sustainability. And we can go into that in a bit more depth. So the main focus was actually identifying what alternatives are there. So we carried out a market review focusing on biomaterials that self-identify as leather alternatives. And I'll come onto that in a second as well, because leather is a protected term. Then 100% fossil fuel-based plastics were outside the scope of this research. So we wanted to focus on primarily bio-based, plant-based materials. But as some of you might have caught the discussion that Martin and Lillian and I were having in the beginning, of course, there are completely fossil fuel-based plastics as well that could be alternatives and are readily used in the industry. So for example, currently about 80 to 90% 70 to 80% of products that are leathers are animal hide leathers, but about 30% or so are what they refer to as imitation leathers. So based on polyurethanes, PVC, fossil fuel-based plastics of those sorts. And we wanted to recognize that the majority of alternative vegan leathers are going to be mixed materials. So we did not want to mention that they cannot, only 100% fossil fuel-based plastics were ignored, but if there was 70% fossil fuel-based plastics, then that was okay for this study so far. We also wanted to identify the key performance criteria for leather in cricket gear, particularly balls and gloves, so that we could then go on to do future studies as well to understand what criteria are particularly important for these two applications, and they are slightly differing performance specifications. Also, this would help identify what is it in animal hide leather that can't or cannot easily be replicated by vegan leathers. Because again, these specifications are not obvious and manufacturers are not willing to openly share these specifications as well. We also then wanted to carry out some preliminary testing on the potential alternatives. And here in this project, we focused on strength and elongation in testing, in tension. So basically stretching a material and seeing at what load it fails and what its stretchiness is, its elongation is. These are fundamental material performance indicators and are actually used by Kookaburra, by SG, and by Dukes, who are the three big cricket ball manufacturers, for example, to test their leathers. But there are many other test protocols that would need to be carried out for cricket ball and glove applications, which this project didn't look at, but in our subsequent circular cricket gear project, we have looked at things that's like stitchability, water absorption performance, as well as abrasion resistance, abrasion performance. Next slide, Lillian, thank you. So firstly, starting off with what is leather. It is defined as effectively treated animal skin. In the UK, for example, 87% of leather that is produced is bovine leather. And again, cricket gear is primarily reliant on cow hides. So for example, India produces 80% of the world's cricket balls. And 80% of those cricket balls are derived from cowhide, but some also derive from buffalo or ox hide, but these are referred to as sub-performance. Duke's balls, which are produced, or the raw materials primarily come from the UK. They are actually produced in India or Pakistan. They come from Angus cows in Scotland and then are processed in Derbyshire. But as we mentioned, the vast majority of the balls are still produced in India. So the material is transported to India for primary processing and then finished back in the UK. And the main thing I wanted to get to in this slide was the discussion around what leather is and the fact that it is a protected term. So the British Standard Glossary of Leather Terms has a very specific definition of leather, and it's outlined over here. You're welcome to read it in its full detail later on. But the basic idea is that you are not allowed to call anything as leather. It has to satisfy this definition. Otherwise, the Sale of Goods Act and the Trade Description Act applies in terms of suing, for example. This is the definition that is used in applying consumer protection legislation. And even terms like plant-based leathers or vegan leathers, they are not technically suitable. You might have to apply some other caveats to it. Recycled leather also has certain caveats that it needs to that need to be made, because, for instance, they mention over here the thickness needs to be at least 0.15 millimeters, and it cannot be reconstituted, for instance. So you might have to refer to it as reconstituted leather specifically rather than just leather. So this has some implications on circularity in general, which we are trying to grapple with. Next slide, Lillian, thank you. And here it is. Leather is of natural animal origin, and that leather cannot be used in the denomination of man-made materials. So you might have to think about what a man-made material is. If it is semi-synthetic, if it is viscose-based, for example, then it might not satisfy this criteria. Or if it is polyurethane-based, then it might not satisfy this criteria. And similarly with reconstituted leather, there are some specificities as well. So minimum of 50% dry leather fibers. And a lot of this idea is around the fact that leather is actually a fibrous material. It looks very homogeneous, but there are protein-based fibers within the material, within the hide of the animal's skin, that give it those specific properties. Now, the standards for cricket balls and gloves refer to leather that meet these definitions. So cricket balls in particular require the casing to be made from alum tanned leather. Gloves do not necessarily require the use of leathers, but when leather is used, it needs to meet certain criteria, particularly related to color fastness and the amount of chromium in the material. This currently restricts alternative leathers from being used officially for cricket gear, and Martin is particularly trying to look at changing some of these British standards, or looking at how circularity and sustainability can be important criteria in future design specifications as well. Next slide, Lillian, thank you. So Beth carried out a huge amount of market research using some key criteria, as well as the Material Innovation Initiative website, which holds a very large database of relevant companies. And just on the scope we focused on, so for example, excluding 100% fossil fuel-based plastics, we found 87 companies that produced 123 different types of alternative vegan leathers. They were all in very different stages of innovation. Some were very much at the early phases of startup. Others had put in some patent applications or had been granted patents, but very few were actually in production or in full-scale production. So Pinatex, for example, and Bananatex were the outliers, but others, it was even hard to get a few samples from them, A5 sheet sized, for instance, and that limited the amount of testing that we could go on to do. There were also some of them, because they were in funding cycles and investment cycles, they were not willing to share a huge amount of data, for instance, what the key ingredients of their products were because of proprietary information, for instance, or they were not very happy for us to do testing and then share it widely, because then that might influence funding cycles later on, particularly if sport was not an interesting area for them currently. They were mainly focused on apparel and shoes, for example. But nevertheless, we found that the market was rapidly growing, with many companies changing, a few websites that were stated in some of the innovation databases, they were not functional, etc. So it was quite difficult to keep track of these companies as well. Then we produced a huge database, and this is publicly available on our website that Martin and Lillian can share later on as well. So for each company, we have the various materials that they produce that are self-styled vegan leathers, what the natural components are, if there are plastic components that are known what they are, what manufacturing process has been used, properties and characteristics of these that have been publicly available, as well as where these companies operate and any sustainability credentials. So have they conducted a life cycle assessment, or an EPD is available, and any compliance to regulations. And these can be things like REACH compliance if they're using specific types of polymers or plastics, or yeah, things of those sorts. And next slide, Lillian, please. And to share an example entry, this is Question, who produced the banana text material. The natural component in that particular example is from the abaca plant. It is a banana plant, but it is actually not an edible banana. So it's primarily grown for its fibers rather than for its for the fruit. There is no plastic component in it, so it's actually a textile material, and that's something we found very often, that these were predominantly textile-based materials, and therefore slightly different testing criteria and standards applied to them in comparison to conventional leathers. And a detail of how the alternative leather is manufactured, the locations where they operate. It's fully biodegradable because there is no plastic component. It's completely cellulose based. And they have also a certified gold cradle to gate LCA conducted, for instance. So a fair bit of information, as well as any references that we have available for them. Next slide, Lillian. We also carried out an interesting categorization of these 123 different alternative leathers, trying to think about where the innovations might come from, and therefore what sectors might we want to bring together later on, for example. So for instance, a number of these are plant-based, so some based on leaves of fibers. So Piñatex is pineapple leaf fiber, or Deserto is cactus leaf fiber, so that falls under the leaf category. Some derived from trunks and stems of plants, so Bananatex or Barktex, so from tree bark fibers. So that would be in another category. Some from fruits, vegetables, and flowers. So apple skin, grape skin as well would fall under this category. Some are cell cultured, so Biofabrica, for instance. So these are bacterially derived, and I saw recently, just yesterday, some that are using bacterial celluloses that are eating coconut fibers, for example. So it's a combination of some of these two categories. There is other fibers that are, leathers that are based on fish scales or waste seashells. So Hide Biotech is an example of this. Some derived from fungus. So fungi skin is an example of this, or mycelium-based leathers. Others that are plant-based, but it is not exactly clear what they might be. And then some have varied compositions as well. So we carried out this categorization, and within each as well, we categorize them as either waste-derived, that are grown specifically for these, that are harvested, or that is unknown. And you can see that actually many fall under the unknown category, because not a lot of information is available on this. Next slide, Lillian, thank you. So from the mapping study, a few main conclusions were derived. Firstly, that the vegan leather industry is growing quite quickly, but there is a huge amount of data that we don't have, a classic problem similar to the cricket gear industry. No alternative leather has been designed specifically for sporting applications yet. Most have been targeting the apparel fashion sector because they see a clear driver for it, particularly from the consumer push side. And that might be interesting to listen to the next part of this presentation. What is the consumer side of things, and can that be an innovation driver for the cricket gear sector? There are also interesting value forums such as the Fibril Material Alliance that are trying to bring together these various players and drive the sector forward. There are a couple of limited studies. Actually, we found one that is by the Filk Group, F-I-L-K, at Freiburg Institute. And looking into them, actually, they are an institute for leather and plastic sheets. So that's a caveat just to mention. And they tested, I think, 4 or 5 different plant-based leathers and fungal leathers, and compared it to conventional leathers, and compared 5 key properties: tensile strength, tear resistance, flex resistance, water vapor permeability, water vapor absorption. And they found that in all of these categories, the bovine leather tended to perform better. But again, these were at an early stage of the development of some of these materials. We also identified that more research was needed, particularly on any performance testing that mimicked the use of cricket gear in practice. Yeah, I think we have been quite clear on these. Some of these standard test protocols are helpful, but they might not give sufficient information to give confidence to manufacturers on their use for cricket balls or cricket gloves, particularly smell, for instance, or abrasion resistance is a key one. If the ball is rolling for a test match, which can be a very long period of time, how does that leather abrade on the pitch, on different types of grasses? If it hits some infrastructure component of the stadium, for example, as well as stitchability being a key criteria. And then also the manufacturing processes of each material should be analyzed in order to identify and inspire new fabrication methods. And cost and supply chains need further clarity, because they also have knock-on effects on the overall life cycle assessment of a product. Next slide, Lillian, thank you. And then we did some testing on these materials, starting off by looking at some of the performance criteria. So this is actually, yeah, you can play that video if you like, Lillian. This is some micro CT analysis. So putting a cricket ball into a 3D scanner using X-rays and scanning the material and the composition without actually cutting through the ball. So cricket balls have a variety of different components. They have a polish on the outside, and then they have the leather casing. So the polish is quite critical to give the performance that leather actually has. Nitrocellulose or polyurethane coating is very, very common. And without that, the leather will not perform as well. So that's a caveat that's quite important. So you still have to do some extra manipulation of the leather to make it perform well. And then the leather is specifically alum tan leather, and the core is made usually of cork, or more commonly nowadays of rubber or a cork rubber composite core. So in this case, this is the Gun & More cricket ball. This has a cork rubber composite core. Very common. So it's not just a single piece of cork, it's actually granulated cork and rubber that have been molded specifically to shape, and then the leather is wrapped on top of it, and then you stitch it all together. There are a couple of different ways, and perhaps in a later presentation on Thursday, I might go into that in a bit more detail in the Circular Cricket Gear webinar. But the leather particularly arrives at 4 to 4.5 millimeters in thickness, and then it is dried and compressed to about 3.5 millimeters in thickness. And when it gets to that compressed thickness of 3.5 millimeters, it has already had the dyeing process done to it, the tanning process done to it, things of those sorts. So the properties of the 3.5 millimeter thick leather are particularly interesting, and that's what we used as the benchmark for this project. Next slide, Lillian. So the performance criteria for the balls were mainly the thickness it arrived at, the density of the material, particularly the linear density, mass per unit area, which is quite commonly used in the textile and the leather sector, as well as the strength in tension and compression, hardness and durability, absorption and abrasion response. There are also some environmental properties. So water absorption is particularly critical, UV stability as well. Cricket balls might start to lose their color, but also their rigidity over time with sun exposure, and dimensional stability. Manufacturing was particularly important from the manufacturer's perspectives, things like machinability, flexibility, because you need to stretch the ball leather onto the spherical surface. And it's interesting how the definition of either 2 or 4 different pieces of leathers, and some cricket balls have 2 pieces, some have 4 pieces, and test match and one-day cricket balls might have slightly different from the same manufacturer. So it's very interesting how they decide to choose one or the other. And then the tear strength and thickness for the stitching, compatibility with lacquers is very critical, because some use beeswax, some use historically aniline or fats, animal fats for the coating as well, and how they decide to use nitrocellulose or polyurethanes, and how that attaches to the leather. And then also the compatibility of the leather with the core material. And then the sustainability aspect is particularly important to us, but hopefully to others as well. In the next slide, we talk about gloves. These are categorized or specified based on this specific British standard. It does not specify that leather has to be used or it needs to be used for any part of the glove, because it recognizes that gloves are very multi-material products. But they do mention that color fastness, the pH level, the chemical properties of the gloves, of the leather, needs to be within specific criteria. From manufacturers, we know that it's primarily Pittard's leather that is used. Sheepskin leather, it's significantly good in moisture absorption. It can absorb 4 to 5 times its weight in water, for instance. And it's also very soft, which helps with the gripping, we presume. So water repellence is important, strength in elongation and tension, the supple nature of it, and how it changes over time. As many of us might have noticed, that the glove leather might become a bit crusty over time, or it might become harder, more rigid over time as well. The manufacturing is particularly important. You will notice that there are holes, perforations in it for making it breathable. So for odor regulation, for instance, and therefore you need to make sure that even with those holes in there, it is still an intact structural material, and then the stitchability as well. Next slide, Lillian. So we did some preliminary testing on a couple of different examples, mainly Barktex, which is based on the bark of a fig tree. Very interesting, and I can do a presentation just on this fiber in itself. It's has important heritage applications found in Africa, in the Polynesian islands, in a variety of different indigenous applications. It's just carved from the tree, a bit like cork is, and it naturally has this woven structure. So very fascinating, but it's significantly porous. It has had some applications for footwear, so for soles as well as for the casing for footwear. So Barktex was one, 100% bio-based. There is no other additive on it. Similarly, Bananatex, based on these abaca leaves, 100% bio-based, cellulose-based. There is no additive on it. There are some variations of Bananatex that have a backing to it, but not all of them. They also use a beeswax coating for it for moisture repellence, and some higher performance variants use a PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene, as a coating, Teflon effectively for the coating. We also tested High Biotech, which is fish waste and reprocessed, reconstituted, so not vegan, but interesting in terms of its thickness and its homogeneity. And we tested Peniatex, derived from pineapple leaf fibers. Although this has PLA, polylactic acid, derived from corn or beetroot sugars that are mixed with the pineapple leaf fibers to give that water repellence. So pineapple leaf fibers are probably around 40% of the material. PLA is about 12 to 15% of the material. Both of these are bio-based. And then there is polyurethane, fossil fuel based, that accounts for the remaining 40 to 50% of this material. So High for the sporting application. There are other variants that are significantly higher in pineapple leaf fibers, but they are either too thin or they are more suited for handbags or those kind of accessories, and therefore were not considered suitable for this particular application in sporting goods. Next slide, Lillian. So we did some testing on these. Primarily tensile testing is what we focus on for this presentation, pulling these materials apart. And we found that the Peniatex was quite interesting, where the polyurethane backing failed first, and then the fibers started to pull out. In the Barktex, we saw classic failure of a textile, where you see significant fiber failure and also very jagged failure surface, which indicates that you need to have some form of backing material to make it more homogeneous, or else you might get fraying of the fibers. We also tested Bananatex. This had the highest strength and failure performance, which was refreshing because it is also 100% bio-based. But we did see quite a bit of fraying of the fibers as well in this case. The Hyde Biotex was particularly interesting. It was more like a elastomeric material, in which we actually saw that the rubber stretched a fair bit, 5 times more than some of the other examples. But then once it failed, the material went back to its initial elongation, a bit like our rubber elastomeric band. When you stretch it and then it breaks, it goes back to its initial length. So that's the kind of failure behavior we started to observe in this. All of these are fairly different to leather. Leather actually stretches to a large amount and then actually stays at that failure load. It also has a significantly higher failure load than any of the samples that we tested. However, we found that some of these examples might be suitable for glove leathers, for instance. Another leather that we started to become interested in a bit later on, and following some research by Lillian particularly, was on these chamois leathers or fake chamois leathers, vegan chamois leathers that are based on PVA or viscose-based polymers and perform relatively well, except the abrasion performance doesn't. And again, we can talk about that later on. Next slide, Lillian. So just the key observations, and I think this is my final slide. We found that the Hyde Biotech ball and glove leather samples had the highest elongation and toughness, so the ability to withstand fracture, and that's primarily because it's very stretchy, so it can absorb much more energy before failure. But the Bananatex samples were the strongest. We also found that, the edges of Bananatex, Barktex, there was significant fraying of the woven structure. We actually had to spend a significant amount of time trying to develop test methods, because these are textile-based samples, materials, and they have very specific test standards. Leathers have their own test standards. So how should we actually compare them together? Because testing these textile-based samples using the leather standards is not actually fair and might not lead to the actual failure mechanisms we might see in the application. So that was a challenge. So we had to try and find an intermediate method that would work for both leathers as well as for these textile-based vegan leathers. We found that only Hyde Biotech leather was thick enough to withstand stitching, but the effects of stitching and the stitching itself was set in a separate project, which we had a presentation on Thursday. And I think those are the primary observations on the material analysis and explorations so far.
Okay, excellent, Darshil. I think perhaps, was there one bit? Yeah, so just the recommendations for further research, we can come back to this later, Martin, if we want to have a more overview of it as well. Okay, well, I think perhaps for time, maybe we can pick those specific questions to Darshil up with Lillian So maybe we just crack on with the next presentations and we'll deal with all questions and observations at the end.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Martin. So I'm now going to present some of the player survey findings, along with findings from a retrofit refurbished batting glove exercise. So we conducted an online survey between the 1st of April and the 25th of April 2023. The main aim of the survey was to gain insight into the different levels of awareness and interest in sustainability issues amongst cricket players, also to identify key product-related failures and assess the market acceptability for sustainable cricket gear. The survey was circulated to an email list of 114 individuals. We also contacted cricket players who distributed the survey amongst their teams. And the survey was also piloted with full cricket experts to verify the scope and content of the questionnaire. Overall, the survey received 42 responses. And just to show a breakdown of the survey demographic and context, these are the percentages in terms of level of play. 83% of respondents identified as being male players, and overall the primary age of respondents was over 55, so 41% claimed to be over 45. The second age group was between 45 and 55, and then 14% indicated to be between 18 and 25. Now, the average of games played per year by the respondents was 13. And then in terms of the cricket gear use phase, cricket gloves appeared to be kept for over 8 seasons by 38% of the respondents, and between 2 and 3 seasons by 36%. So in terms of the responses received that align to the sustainability considerations, 57% of the respondents indicated that they have considered the environmental impact of the cricket gear in the past 6 months. However, when asked to elaborate further, the majority of the respondents had not identified specific environmental issues. And then we had several questions asking the respondents to create a list of which were the issues that they considered to be the most relevant, and the majority focused primarily on the disposal of cricket gear at the end of life and the carbon footprint associated with the cricket gear supply chain. When asked specifically in terms of the impact of using bovine leather within the gear, respondents did not perceive this to be a significant contributor to the negative environmental impacts associated with the production of cricket gear. And then aligned to this, only one respondent selected that the use of bovine leather was the highest contributor to environmental degradation. And then conversely, carbon emissions related to overseas manufacturing and transportation were perceived as the highest contributor, and this was followed by the use of materials derived from non-renewable sources. So from this perspective, and from a user-player perspective, replacing bovine leather with a vegan leather is potentially not perceived as a priority for reducing the negative impacts associated to the production of cricket gear. However, we had another section within the survey where we asked specifically on how vegan leather was perceived for cricket gear, and surprisingly, 70% of respondents indicated that they would consider replacing existing gear of vegan leather alternative, even though, as previously mentioned, the use of bovine leather wasn't considered as the highest contributor. Now, the main reasons highlighted for this was that it aligns to various lifestyles such as veganism or an increased awareness of sustainability considerations. It was also highlighted that to consider switching to cricket gear incorporating vegan leather alternatives, new equipment would have to be required to match existing products in terms of durability, quality, and performance. And likewise, these new products would have to be affordable. So cost was also a main topic that was raised during both the interviews and the survey. And then 29% of the respondents indicated that they would not consider using the cricket gear made from vegan leather alternatives. And this was due primarily to a perception of vegan leathers as being of lower quality in terms of durability and performance. So for example, at the moment, vegan leather is perceived as not being as hard wearing or as true to bovine leather. So to conclude the findings from these surveys, players do not consider the use of bovine leather to be a high contributor to negative environmental impact. However, there is a high market interest amongst players for cricket gear incorporating vegan leather alternatives. Again, the main reasons is for improved product sustainability and alignment to specific lifestyles. However, there is also a need to conduct further research that will improve player perception on the quality, durability, and technical performance of vegan leathers. To conclude, industry must address first player user confidence in the material, and this requires further research into player user behavior and a wider demonstration of the technical and functional properties of the vegan leathers. So yeah, again, we can go, yep, sorry.
Another quick point, I guess. In terms of the sample, we thought it was a reasonable size sample. It's, you know, obviously not as large as we'd hoped, but the key thing there is a slightly older demographic than, say, your average, you know, playing demographic. So in an odd sense, it was even more interested that the older groups were still open to vegan leathers, particularly with cricket being quite a conservative sector. So that was quite surprising to us. And I think that's something that we would sort of probe a little bit further, not for something for today, but for our session on the circularity of the cricket year. What also evolved was quite strong interest in repair services for pads and gloves. We know already that it's almost integrated now with bats, you know, repair and refurbishment services, but not for gloves and pads. So there was strong interest in repair services that we'll pick up on the webinar later in the week. Back to you, Lillian.
Thank you, Martin. And then, yeah, moving on with the presentation. So we will now go into the findings from a retrofit refurbishment batting glove exercise. So the aim of the study was primarily to assess the feasibility for a pair of cricket batting gloves, and this was to extend the product's use phase using a vegan leather to replace bovine leather. So as a result of this exercise, insight into the most common product-related faults that result in the disposal of cricket batting pads were identified. And the study also provided an overview of the challenges faced when attempting to repair or refurbish a pair of cricket batting gloves. The repair exercise was completed on a pair of right-handed gloves, as this is the glove that showed the most signs of wear and tear, and this is due to the previous owner being a right-handed player. So a bit of background to the gloves. These were used for about 3 seasons from a player who plays high standard league cricket based in Nottinghamshire in England. And then the player was asked how many seasons the gloves were used and how they were looked after and stored after each use. So after use, if it was a particularly hot day, these would be left to dry due to excessive sweat, but otherwise there is generally users don't tend to have any specific care requirements for their gear. So yeah, these were primarily placed in the player's cricket bag immediately after use, and then this was stored in their garage until the next game. And then regarding the quality of the gloves that were refurbished, these seem to be of high quality and perhaps best quality experienced by the user. So what we did initially for this study was to identify each component of the product, material, and then describe signs of wear and tear. So for this palm, we can see how there's a discoloring of the leather due to sweat, and however, it has lost some of its softness and flexibility, but it was still flexible enough for its intended purpose. Then image B indicates the wear and tear of the thumb, and this appears to be significant. There are visible holes to the upper part of the thumb, and this is primarily the component that appears to show the most wear and tear of the overall glove. As for the various, for the fingers, image C indicates significant wear and tear to the upper part of the fingers, where the stitches show significant tearing and the internal padding has been exposed. However, in terms of the level of protection and use, this appears to not be affected by the exposure of the internal padding. And then analysing further the gloves, there's a slight tear to the palm on image D, as well as the sides of the gloves that can be perceived on image F. Again, slight discoloration. This is the left-hand glove. So again, light discoloration on the palm. You can see how, in terms of exposure to the padding from the internal finger section, is less exposed within the left-hand glove. And then again, a similar signs of wear and tear on the thumb of the glove. So from these, based on the relevant signs of wear and tear that were indicated within each glove, it was then decided to refurbish the palm and the thumb as indicated in this table. Now, the tearing of the fingertips shown in the image C do not affect the level of protection and functionality of the product, and therefore, after closely analysing the composition and potential assembly of the gloves and identifying the various parts and components, the sequence for disassembly of the product are the following. So we started out by disassembling the palm from the thumb. The thumb was disassembled as a single component. To do this, we used a seam ripper that was used for separating the various components. Once we started to tear into the stitches due to the leather becoming quite thin due to use, it was relatively easy to tear off the palm almost in a single piece. So in terms of time, it was quite straightforward, and it didn't apply a lot of effort to separate the palm from the overall glove. Now, image K does show the textile lining of the back of the palm, which is quite stained due to the sweat. And another important factor to mention in terms of the disassembly process is the hygiene and odor related considerations when attempting to refurbish or repair personal protective gear. So this was seen as a key area that needs to be addressed, as it could hinder reuse, repair and refurbishment of a product. Secondly, we separated the thumb from the palm. Again, a fabric picker was also used for this. However, the state of the leather in relation to the stitches for this section remained in quite good condition, and therefore each stitch had to be manually unpicked. So this was quite time consuming. And then thirdly, we separated the thumb into individual components, as you can see in image N. Yeah, the thumb is composed of 2 leather sections to facilitate flexibility, and these were separated as the top part shown in N2 showed significant signs of wear and tear. So we decided to only replace with the vegan leather this section of the thumb. And then, as mentioned previously, there's an internal rubber thumb protector which is intact, and therefore one of the recommendations that we will go through further is that this can be reutilized within the refurbished thumb or used for new products. So now moving on to the refurbishment process. The material that was selected, and as mentioned by Darshil, we replaced the Petard leather with a synthetic vegan chamois leather. The Centre for Sustainable Design became aware of existing vegan leathers after meeting with Ely cricket club players who were also doing R&D into vegan cricket balls, and had developed an early stage prototype of a glove. The material was selected due to its absorbency and flexibility, both of which are technical requirements for the gloves. The pattern for the glove was produced using the silhouette of the existing palm. So we traced, we traced the palm over the new synthetic chamois leather, leaving 0.5 centimeters for the seam allowance. The palm and thumb sections were sewn by hand, as using an industrial sewing machine was not viable due to the limited space between the fingers. So initially the side of the palm was restitched, followed by the little finger and ring finger, and then it was decided to integrate the thumb before completing the overall palm. So in hindsight, before attaching the palm to the overall glove structure, it would have been less time consuming to start by replacing the thumb and then sewing this onto the component rather than as 2 separate parts. So this prototype has been tested. It has been tested twice in May by the same person that donated the glove initially. The gloves have been tested for 1.5 hours and subsequently for 15 minutes. And then initial feedback provided by the user is that the odor of the gloves remains problematic. So this is potentially one of the main key issues related to refurbishing gloves. The material appears to be slightly too thick. We have also received other comments related to the thickness of the material. However, it may be due to personal preference, so further testing is recommended. Now, the thickness and breathability of the material may be an issue for warmer months, as this was tested in May, and at the moment, the material doesn't feel quite right, but in a sense, testing is an early indication of some of the technical requirements that would be required for vegan leather. And then also, as you can see in the images, the gloves have started to fray and disintegrate in the palms and the thumbs. So key learnings and recommendations from this exercise: the total time for producing the refurbished prototype of one right-hand glove was 3 hours in total. De-stitching and unpicking the palm was relatively easy and straightforward. The thumb protector remained intact, so this is a key component to be considered for reuse. And therefore, in terms of recommendations, it is recommended to explore further strategies for recovering and reusing this particular component, either for refurbishment or the manufacturing of new gloves. Further research into implementing a recovery or harvesting of other components would be a potential first step. Also, the protection on the back of the palm showed significant deterioration, so perhaps consider for the textile, which is at the moment polyester, to be replaced, and or identify a solution to avoid the sweat discoloration odor. So some initial recommendations: use of polygene technology, implement design solutions that could facilitate product maintenance, such as drying and washing the product, and further research into alternative textiles that have deodorization properties, such as bamboo fibers, is recommended. And then a prototype has also been produced for inner cricket gloves using the same synthetic chamois leather. These have yet not been tested, so we will have further findings related to the inner gloves, but we wanted to show them today just to highlight the various opportunities in using vegan leathers for cricket gear. So now I will.
Can I just add a sort of another quick point? So with the inner gloves, this was produced by a manufacturer, prototype. They claim to have looked at it in relation to gloves, and as Lillian said, claimed that it was too thick, and then they went on to inner gloves. Although the information and details are slightly patchy at the moment in terms of indeed being consistent with our experience with the manufacturers. Also, in addition, just a very pragmatic experience is that we have been trying to send independently gloves to I think it's to both India and Spain through two different sources, and none of those gloves have either gone to India or Spain, where we were doing. So there is still significant problems in the logistics chain. It appears, I think, some gloves that was it gloves, Lillian, that we sent to, were you trying to send those originally to Spain directly, that went to Northampton and Milton Keynes about, must be 3-4 months ago, have not got through to the destination, and also with a donation from Chris Whitaker on the call, similarly trying to transport these to Spain. They've still not arrived, even though that's, I don't know, 6 weeks ago. So there's still some big challenges with UK supply chains, it seems, to the moment. And I think this resulted from a cyber attack on the British postal system. That has led to this huge backlog of stuff to be sent out to various countries. So yes, it's been quite a challenging process to get to these prototypes. One of the reasons we went for this the particular material we used was a very pragmatic decision. Given Darshal's experience with the challenges of getting the materials from the supply chain, we became aware of this vegan leather that was being sold, and we pragmatically decided to use that, even though it might not have been the most perfect example, but this way at least we moved through the process. And the only reason, particularly the inner cricket gloves, were produced by the manufacturer in India is because our contact put them in his bag and he took them to India. So that way we got round the British postal system. So anyway, I'll shut up there and maybe we can open up to questions and discussion. Hopefully have some questions and discussion. There's a lot of information there. Do you think, is there anything that is surprising to people there? Or is Prakash, maybe you could kick off?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we are manufacturers in India of cricket equipment, and we export a large percentage of our product. So I have a few comments, if I may. I mean, first of all, I think this study is very fascinating. But I'm not sure if we're going in the right direction, because if you think of the game of football, there's one football, 22 players, and if the value of the football sold is relatively small, the value of the equipment is much more. And similarly with cricket balls, first of all, cricket balls are very small, so the amount of leather used is very small. And I think more leather would be used on the equipment. That's my first point. Secondly, I think that gloves these days, a large number of gloves are made of sheepskin. Somebody said that they're mainly made of petards, but petards is only for the very top quality gloves. It's excellent leather, but it's only used on the top quality of gloves. So on cheaper gloves is normal sheepskin, sourced from India or Pakistan or wherever. And for even cheaper gloves, they would use cowhide on the palm. And my other point is that I think, you know, we have to keep watching the ICC regulations. ICC have a very tight grip on the game. They don't let you change a cricket bat. Even refurbishing cricket bats becomes a problem. So if you look at tennis or hockey, things have become totally synthetic there. The beauty of cricket is the bounce is unpredictable. The willow, every piece of willow is different. And I think you have to work in collaboration with the ICC also. You need their input as well, because at some stage they shouldn't suddenly say this is not acceptable. So these are a couple of the points which I wanted to mention.
Okay, well, maybe I can sort of kick off with a couple of points, and then Darshil and Lillian, please chip in, as I'm sure you'll have some observations. So, I mean, the first challenge we've faced is really trying to understand really the size of the cricket market in terms of gear. There just is not reliable information in the public domain. Very, very difficult to get reliable data on the sector. And that's globally or locally in the sense of UK. And what we found is that there's very non-existent data on the so-called end of life of cricket gear. So nobody really has any, there is no clear documented knowledge on what happens to cricket gloves or cricket pads at the end of life. We suspect they're primarily going into landfill. There are some reuse, limited number of reuse schemes in the UK, but the data is incredibly limited. We have tried hard to work with, let's call it, the authorities from the international level through the UK level, but that has proven to be extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. I think most of the focus, well, what we're seeing within UK, for example, there is a sustainability manager in place now, but that role is seemingly primarily focused on looking at the bigger issues, you know, energy use in the venues, the impact of the game, not on the gear itself. But the bottom line is, I guess there is huge amounts of gear that is distributed, you know, and produced, and really there's a real gap in knowledge there. We have also monitored the British standards in detail, and I have 20 years working on British standards in different areas, and a lot of those standards are very old. As a result of some changes in regulations related to personal protective gear, this is potentially leading to some new process to bring these standards up to date that then may identify, you know, opportunities to bring in new knowledge, state of the art, etc. So we have tried closely to follow and understand the standards, and Darshil has gone into that in more detail with the MCC laws of the game. I'll let Darshil mention that. But the ICC, we've had, I'd say, directly zero contact. We've not been able to identify somebody to have a conversation with. We understood at the point about 2 years ago that ECB were employing a sustainability manager, that ICC were going through a similar process, but we've not been able to identify anybody. So we're very happy to talk to all stakeholders and share our knowledge and hear experience, and you know, there's no agenda here as such. We're looking at this as an innovation area. So I'll shut up there, pass over to Darshil and Lillian, and maybe then you would have had some comment back.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Prakash, for your thoughts as well. I think they're all very helpful in getting us to think about how to get the industry energized to consider sustainability more seriously. I think you're right, and Martin and I and many of us, Chris is here as well, we've talked about this, that definitely infrastructure is an area that probably has a bigger impact, but equally thinking about where equipment ends up and how this sector can do its bit for the sustainability and end-of-life management is particularly important, because the sport is growing. There is shortages in specific types of materials as well. So if we can add a bit more thought into why certain approaches are used for the manufacturing of the materials, I think that's helpful as well. One of the things as a material scientist, I find it quite difficult, is there is no clear guidance or specific requirements for why, or logical decisions around why specific materials are used. In some cases, they might be just on the basis of cost. Otherwise, it's not exactly clear why there has been no other material used other than leather. And I appreciate your ideas around the fact that, yes, each bat of willow is different and the bounce of the ball can be different, and that adds a sense of enjoyment to the game as well. But I think that can also be achieved through different means, because pitches and there are other ways to add that sort of level of complexity in the game, I'm sure, apart from the gear. And the other aspect which we don't mention quite a lot is the supply chains around these, because these are quite complex. We are bending our way backwards to use specific materials to make a product that actually, if, for example, Dukes are, or with cricket bats, if they are sending the material halfway across the world to get them fabricated and then reshipped over here, that's not logical in my thinking process. I'm sure we can use a variety of different pool of resources to produce the same sort of enjoyment in the game.
My quick thought there, Darshil, was just briefly to articulate your experience with the bamboo bat. then the challenges with the existing laws of the game and the sort of conversations you've gone through there.
Yeah, so the main challenges there have been, well, cricket bats are regulated quite heavily as well. And when we were trying to get these bamboo cricket bats into the sport, we're still working on it. And the MCC was actually more open to it than we thought they might be, in that they are willing to hear the sustainability side and they understand the important issues around accessibility as well. Because many of these pieces of equipment are quite expensive. Cricket bats can be between 100 to 500 pounds, and that's not cheap. Cricket balls, on the other hand, have the other problem, because we want them to be as cheap as possible, maybe £5 a piece, whereas they are around £15 a piece. So that's another side of the issue. I think the challenge has been to get them to change regulations with a sustainability caveat quickly enough, because a lot of these things take time. Manufacturers will have to find suppliers, get the balls or the gear manufactured to the exact same specification, and that sort of innovation takes time. And so the relevant bodies need to move fast sooner rather than later. Yeah, I think I'll leave that there. Lillian might have something to add, or Chris as well.
Chris, would you like to add something? So yeah, I thank Prakash for his insightful comments, and also from our perspective, it's good to have a manufacturer perspective and how the transition towards sustainable materials would be received at the moment. So perhaps if Prakash could elaborate further on, yeah, how do you think the manufacturers would?
Yeah, I think the manufacturers will be quite open to any change, and I think in the developing world, things can move quite fast because we're not so set in our ways, I guess. But one thing I just wanted to mention about transporting stuff to India and Pakistan to bring it back over here to England is that the English willow is very limited in supply. English willow is the best willow for cricket bats. Willow has been grown all over the world, but nothing can match the climatic and soil conditions with England. I think everybody knows that English weather is very strange. So English willow is the best willow for cricket bats. And there are only 500,000 clefts. That means pieces of one cleft makes one cricket bat. So there are only 500,000 produced in the whole of England. And those are largely shipped abroad, made up into bats and shipped back. And you're right, a bat can retail for as much as £500 because the willow is so expensive, it's so scarce. And now cricket is becoming more popular because of the 20 over game. So there is an increased demand and there's no willow. So it'll be very good if the ICC does approve some alternatives, at least for lower forms of the game. That would be fantastic.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, the main area that we found the ICC is engaged in is a sort of, in terms of gear, is, if I remember rightly, it's sort of like the stickers, and it's this sort of the communications aspect. They don't seem to have got, from our dialogue, so involved in the more detailed elements of the gear itself. So if there is anybody that you'd suggest that we talk to, we'd be very interested to talk to them indeed, because they sort of seem to be floating above some of these issues. and perhaps more focused on the tournaments, you know, the commercial aspects. So we don't see a lot of R&D, you know, being stimulated by, let's say, the supra bodies. But anyway, maybe it's great. Well, thank you very much, Prakash, for your comments, and that we'll absorb those comments and think about that. Particularly, I think the point about the sheepskin rather than the petards, you know, the differentiation. So do we have any other comments? I saw a couple of people showed themselves on the screen. Any other comments or observations or thoughts?
With regards to the material you'll be using, are you following and meeting the standards for the PPE laws in the UK?
Yeah, follow it in great detail and trying to get to the bottom of it, and dialogues going on with the British Standards Industry Federation. But our understanding, you know, and if there's anybody on the call that has more information on this, is so British Standards about a year ago were starting to a process to look at the cricket gear PPE, so gloves, boxes, etc., pads, to look at bringing those standards up to date, because a number of those standards are very old, you know, 20 plus years old. And so that process started, and we had discussions, and but then as we understand it, you know, what's been fed back to us is that there is some dialogue going on between the ECB and the trading standards bodies about potentially how these regulations will be implemented, because it's the trading standards people that are in effect the regulators. The issue you face with that is there is no universal approach by the trading standards bodies about how to approach this. So it still seems very much in the air. BSI seemed to be quite open to set up a revision process.
Yeah, you've been saying that for 15 years.
Yeah, but I think on the basis of, well, they should be every 5 years revising standards, but that's not happened in the case of whatever it was, any of these standards. So for some reason, these standards have not been updated. But as I said, they physically, you know, initiated a set of discussions around setting it up. But the feedback we have is that they're waiting feedback from ECB and trading standards as to what happens next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make sense from what,
yeah, it does.
what you're picking up?
And obviously the products out there, a lot of those don't even meet the standards as it is.
Yeah. I mean, the issue that we found in going into the sector is that neither ECB saw this PPE regulation coming. You know, this is our comment and observation. And because there's perhaps we've got...
They did see it coming for sure. They would have seen it coming. It's been done years ago, yeah.
Well, the PPE regulation, you know, happened late 2000, whatever it was, something like 2018, 2019, 2020 is our understanding. And I don't know, they may or may not, one would hope they would, but we have not found anybody who's got clear information on that. We also have identified, because there are, and I can't remember what the latest figure we have, Lillian, can you remember, is it 250 to 300 companies placing cricket gear on the market?
Yes.
It's about that figure is what we've had back, you know, but nothing in the public domain. This is by discussion. We've got this figure. It's, of course, there's a lot of those guys are micro enterprises, those, you know, from the bedroom brands to the larger sports retailers. But of course, there's no trade association that represents the sector. So what we'd found and had come to us is there were some networks around some of the organizations that are aware of this, but they weren't really clear on this. So as you'd seen a lot of other sectors, you would have maybe the sector getting together and lobbying and getting its position across to the regulators before legislation came in. But we've not seen that in the sector. I've seen both sets of approaches in different sectors I've operated in. So yes, as we understand it, there is interest in BSI. I think that's perhaps gone up a notch or two in terms of looking at the revision of the standards, but there is something in the system that people are waiting for before action can be taken.
Yeah, I'm aware. I just wanted to check if you guys were looking into that.
Yeah, it's a big potential. The biggest issue there that we're finding is the challenges about the capacity for third-party testing.
Mm-hmm.
Big issues there in terms of if all items, if all people who are placing product on the market will be required to do third-party testing, A, the cost associated with that, and B, the lack of capacity to do that. The issue also is, will you start to see manufacturers going back into the supply chain to say, maybe in India and northern India, Pakistan, where the clusters are, that we will require our suppliers to do that. And again, you'll have issues to do with equipment to do the testing, etc. So it seems to be it's a complex set of issues.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for that. I just wanted to check with you.
No worries. But it does mean, I guess, on a sort of higher level with the whole growth in the women's game, 2020, 2010, the hundreds, this regulation, coming in, it's a sort of point where various elements of change are coming into the sector, and this sort of balance between the new and the old, just at a quite high level, is it actually an interesting time where innovations may be, innovation opportunities might emerge, with the women's ground going in. Will women be more open to new innovation than some of the guys? So there's a lot of questions starting to emerge that we're picking up. Any other points or observations?
I thought the survey there's some interesting findings in there. I realize it is a fairly small sample to start with, but just like you were saying, I think we need to understand more from the female game. You're right. I'm sure we'll get a much more or much different point of view from that, and that the interest in terms of alternate products will be, I think, looking to be explored in that particular area. Yeah, and also interesting the age differential in who replied and who didn't. I know partially why that is, because the survey did go out to the over 60s cricket playing population, and I think they've probably got more time to fill in surveys, so they probably were more into doing it. But yeah, I, in terms of some questions that could lead us in different directions, I think that we need to get it out again and keep building on it. I would suggest give us a lot of good information.
Exclusively go out to the over 60s, but
No,
a proportion of it was to the older age groups, as you said. But in an odd way, we do absolutely recognize that. But in an odd way, it was interesting for us to see within the older demographic there was actually the openness into alternative leathers, which was slightly surprising. I would be expected to see that much higher in younger age groups, and perhaps with maybe in amongst women players, but I think there's some food for thought there. Do we have any other comments or observations or thoughts? Or is it, I'm not sure if it's Schwab, which way round your name is. Is it
I can help
Schwab?
you.
Yeah.
Friedman Schaber, a lecturer at
Friedman.
the University of Northampton. Now, Martin, Northampton has been mentioned in the conversation. Really welcome study for us at the University of Northampton, and also, of course, the wider areas, not just around leather and shoe industry, but also about alternative materials, and perhaps also re-elevating what I think is a traditional craft skills and actually the supply chain that I'm, as an industrial, more involved. So for me, it's personally more the automotive supply chain, high-end interiors than let's call it cricket sports, which we Germans don't really know much about. However, there were findings, especially around sort of emerging natural materials, that really echoes what our colleagues at the Institute for Creative Leather Technologists are undertaking, and there will be synergies. What I found very poignant, and you did mention it, the supply chain issues that you experienced, having to send out the gloves to be restitched to Spain and India. It might have to do with postal issues, but I think it's also to do with the de-skilling of the labor force in the UK. It's increasingly difficult to find skilled craftspeople and companies that are able to undertake these repair or refurbishment issues. And again, from a Northampton perspective, we have a shoe industry, a high-end shoe industry that survived. However, it's so difficult to find staff to generate the next generation of shoemakers. So all the labor force in Northampton are well over the 60s. It's difficult to start and test the new generation to take on those jobs. And again, there is so much scope for not just in craftsmanship, but also repairs and contributing to the circular economy. So it was very, in a way, related to the situation we find ourselves in.
What we found on the repair of the gloves, we found no repair services in the UK for the gloves, but we have found that in India. The issue there will be cost and skills. The issues we were talking about in terms of trying to get the products out, that was just to get samples made utilizing the vegan leather. So that was just an inability to get product out to people. But absolutely, we've been following the Heritage Crafts report in a lot of detail, which effectively says, we're down to a limited number of cricket bat manufacturers in the UK. In terms of the balls, there's just one, and that's the Duke's ball, but that's not fully, manufactured in the UK. Certain processes are done in India. And we found effectively no production of the pads, the gloves, etc. in the UK. It's all outsourced production to India. So let's say the indigenous cricket gear manufacturing sector in the UK is extremely limited. But on the sales and marketing side, you've got all these very small 250 to 300 suppliers. What we picked up from the industry, something called bedroom brands, which are the sort of smart young people that they maybe play in a league, or they're linked to a couple of leagues, so they've got some customers. They'll then identify a supplier in India or Pakistan, and then they'll slap a logo on it, and they'll just sell it, to the players. So that as a group seems to have emerged more over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, perhaps because the barriers, to enter the market are limited, but effectively, there's a very limited gear manufacturing sector. One of the other aspects we're thinking about is, if we could, is there a way to make it more low carbon? Could we bring stuff back to the UK? Could we use materials that are grown in the UK that substitute existing materials? could we put in place a more proactive refurbishment and repair process at the end of the first life? Big issue is skills. We are trying to find at the moment, all the repair work was done by Lillian, so her expert skills, she did the work, did the excellent work, but we're literally now looking to make a couple of prototypes, further prototypes, and looking at maybe some social enterprises that perhaps have still got the skills, maybe immigrant groups, you know, Afghani groups or people like this, maybe, and you know, so if anybody is aware of any of these groups, we're very keen to talk to them.
I can help.
All right, okay. Well, we'll come back to you, definitely. So I'll start waffling on here, and because I know we're past the time. And do we have any final comments or observations?
Yeah, if I could just quickly mention, excuse me, I don't think there are any equipment manufacturers, gloves and pads in England. It's very labor intensive. Even in India, where we have a factory, you know, it's one person. The gloves these days are so intricate, a guy can hardly make 1.5 pairs a day of batting gloves. But cricket bats are manufactured in the UK still by Gunn & Moore, and there are some smaller companies also manufacturing, and there are a lot of little niche market manufacturers. They may be buying semi-finished bats from India or Pakistan, but they do finish them, and they do repair services. Just for information.
Yeah, no, that's good reinforcement of what we've picked up, and so, you know, that's again what we found, you know, and perhaps has become more ever present, is, you know, maybe 20, 30 years ago, you would struggle to get your bat repaired, but a lot of the producers now will offer that service, and there's even specialist refurbishment, bat refurbishment companies emerging. So, but it's only around the bats. We haven't seen that on the pads or the gloves, and that's mainly because of labor costs. We believe there is there's about 4 or 5 organizations that do that actually are engaged in the reuse of cricket gear, and that is mainly, the main player there is the Lord's Taverners, and effectively still a high proportion of that gear that is collected for reuse is going you know, around the world. It's not staying in the UK for various reasons. So you know, we found some sort of, yeah, quite a lot of interesting things about the detail of that. So yes, yeah. So if anybody has any further thoughts or comments, we're very interested to make sure that we're in touch with the reality of the sector, and we're, you know, we're checking that we haven't missed anything. But we're very happy to talk to people, you know, to see how we can, you know, further improve and your understanding and do some stuff, to be honest. So if anybody has any ideas, I think you have our email. So happy to hear from anybody. And indeed, we will then on the 8th, later in the week, we will we'll have our second webinar on our findings from our broader research study around circularity in the cricket gear, where we'll touch on some of these other issues we've talked about here in a bit more detail. So thank you very much for everybody's attention. And I always say these things. I hope you got one thing that made you think that you questioned or your one action. So just always be realistic, one thing, but hopefully, of course, you got more than that, and very happy to continue to talk to people and hear from you after. So thank you very much indeed for your attention, and thanks for Darshan and Lillian for presenting today, and your Prakash, Chris, and Friedman for your questions. Looking forward to carry on talking to you into the future. Thank you very much. Yeah. Bye.
Yeah.